The millionaire found his twins rummaging through the neighbor's trash, starving to death. And the reason was, if this story interested you, subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Let's begin. If you asked anyone in London who Edward Morrison was, the answer would come with admiration in their eyes. One of the biggest names in British technology, Edward had revolutionized the national market with his company specializing in artificial intelligence applied to medicine, Biotech Global. At 42, the London-based entrepreneur was a constant presence on the covers of leading business magazines, a sought-after speaker at international conferences, and a source of pride for a country still striving to conquer its space in the competitive global innovation market. On that late Friday afternoon, as the sun set over the city of London, Edward landed at Heathrow International Airport after 3 intense weeks of commitments in Europe. Berlin, Paris, London and Lisbon had been the stage for decisive meetings, multi-million-pound contracts, and partnerships that promised to further expand his company. The fatigue of the journey mingled with a sense of accomplishment that only great achievements provide. "Welcome back to the UK, Mr. Morrison," greeted the driver, a middle-aged man who had served him for years as he placed the suitcases in the trunk of the black Range Rover that awaited him. "Thank you, Anthony. How are things here?" Edward asked, settling into the leather seat. "All quiet, sir. The city's the same. Traffic perhaps a little worse," Anthony replied with a discreet smile. The journey from the airport to Belgravia, one of London's most exclusive neighbourhoods, took almost 2 hours due to the typical Friday congestion. Edward took the opportunity to reply to some urgent messages and make a quick video call with his financial director. The numbers were promising. The company's shares had risen 7% in the last week, and a large American hospital was showing interest in implementing the AI-powered diagnostic system developed by Biotech Global. When the car finally turned onto the tree-lined street where his mansion stood, Edward felt that familiar sense of relief. As much as he loved his work and the travels it provided, nothing compared to the feeling of returning home to his 7-year-old twin daughters, Marina and Beatrice. The girls had been his world ever since Lucy, his ex-wife, decided to move abroad after their divorce, leaving the girls in his custody. Edward's mansion was imposing with contemporary lines, large glass windows, and a meticulously maintained garden. A small urban paradise valued at millions. The driver parked in front of the electronic gate, and Edward stepped out of the vehicle, taking a deep breath of the evening air that was beginning to fall. It was then that an unusual scene caught his attention. Across the street, in front of his neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor's house, 2 small figures were crouching by the rubbish bin, rummaging through plastic bags with hurried movements. At first, Edward thought they were street children, something unfortunately common even in that privileged neighborhood. He felt a pang in his chest and decided to approach, to offer help. As he walked towards the children, the streetlight illuminated their faces, and Edward's world stopped. He felt as if the ground had vanished beneath his feet. They were his daughters, Marina and Beatrice, his twins, wearing what appeared to be their school uniforms, now dirty and with small tears. Their brown hair, usually styled in perfectly aligned braids, was disheveled, and there was something in their eyes, a mixture of desperation and shame, that made Edward's blood run cold. "Daddy!" Marina exclaimed upon seeing him, trying to hide something behind her back. Edward knelt before them, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it wanted to burst from his chest. "What are you doing out here, rummaging in the—" He couldn't complete the sentence. "We were looking for food," Beatrice, the more direct of the two, replied, in a voice so low Edward could barely hear it. "Food? What do you mean, food?" he asked, incredulous. "You have a full fridge at home. You have Vanessa." Before the girls could answer, the neighbor's door opened, and Mrs. Eleanor, a woman in her 70s, appeared on the porch. Upon seeing Edward, her expression showed a mixture of relief and embarrassment. "Edward, you're back. Thank goodness," she said, descending the few steps that separated her house from the garden. "Girls, come inside for a bit. I made chocolate biscuits. They're in the kitchen." The twins looked at their father as if asking for permission, and he nodded, still dazed. As they went inside, Mrs. Eleanor approached Edward with a grave expression. "We need to talk," she said, gesturing towards her house. It's important." Edward followed her in silence, trying to process what he had just seen. Mrs. Eleanor's house was cozy, decorated with antique furniture and family photos. A smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked biscuits filled the air, creating a painful contrast with the scene he had just witnessed on the street. While the girls ate biscuits in the kitchen, Mrs. Eleanor led Edward to the living room and indicated an armchair. She sat opposite him, her hands clasped in her lap, like someone gathering courage to say something difficult. "It's not the first time, Edward," she began. "I've been observing your daughters for the past few weeks. They've been coming here almost every day since you left on your trip. Always hungry, always alone." Edward felt dizzy. "But that's not possible. Felicity is there. Vanessa, the housekeeper, too. I left money, cards, instructions." "Felicity leaves very early every day, always dressed up, always elegant," Mrs. Eleanor interrupted. "She returns late at night. As for Vanessa, I haven't seen her in weeks. I think she might have been let go." Edward ran a hand through his hair, feeling a mixture of anger and guilt. Felicity, his current wife, had only been with him for a year. The marriage had been quick, perhaps rushed, but she seemed to love the girls, at least that's what she showed when he was around. "Why didn't the girls call me? They have phones, they know my number." "According to what Marina told me, Felicity collected their phones the day after you left. She said they needed to focus on their studies," the old woman explained with a compassionate look. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, trying to order his thoughts. He needed to act calmly. He needed to understand exactly what had happened during his absence. "Thank you, Mrs. Eleanor," he said finally. "I don't know how to thank you for looking after them." The old woman gently touched his hand. "They are wonderful children, Edward, and you've always been a good father. You just perhaps trusted the wrong people." Edward nodded, standing up. He called the girls, who appeared at the kitchen door with their mouths still stained with chocolate. For a moment, they seemed like normal children, happy with biscuits. But then he noticed the dark circles under their eyes, the subtle thinness that 3 weeks had imposed on those previously healthy little bodies, and something inside him broke. On the way back home, Edward chose not to ask questions. He simply held his daughters, hands firmly, promising himself that he would uncover the whole truth and that he would never let something like this happen again. The mansion's electronic gate opened, and the three entered the spacious grounds. The house was lit, imposing, seemingly perfect. Edward swallowed hard. What other secrets did those walls hold? He decided he would take the girls directly to their rooms, give them a warm bath, and then they would talk. But as they entered, Felicity appeared at the top of the staircase, stunning in a black dress, impeccable makeup, and sparkling jewelry. "Darling, what a wonderful surprise," she exclaimed, descending the steps elegantly. "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." Edward felt the girls tense beside him, squeezing his hands tighter. The fear was palpable, and that was like a stab in the entrepreneur's chest. "Change of plans," he replied, with a calm he didn't feel. "Girls, go up to your room. I'll be there shortly to talk." Marina and Beatrice obeyed promptly, climbing the stairs without looking at their stepmother. Felicity maintained her smile, but her eyes followed the children with a glint that Edward couldn't interpret. "They're so wild, aren't they?" she commented when the girls were out of sight. "I've been trying to impose discipline, but you know how difficult children can be." Edward took a deep breath, controlling himself. "We'll talk later, Felicity. Right now, I need to see my daughters." Without waiting for a reply, he climbed the stairs towards the twins' room, located in the east wing of the house. Upon opening the door, he felt as if he had entered a parallel universe. The rest of the mansion was impeccable, with sophisticated decor, artworks on the walls, and designer furniture. But the girls' room was almost unrecognizable. The curtains were drawn, the main light wasn't working, leaving only the faint glow of a bedside lamp. There was a smell of dampness in the air, and the beds, once comfortable, now had only thin sheets and worn pillows. The toys and books that usually lay scattered around the room had disappeared, as had the photos that decorated the walls. In a corner, Edward saw a small pile of crumpled drawings. Marina and Beatrice were sitting on the edge of one of the beds, as if awaiting instructions. Edward approached slowly and knelt before them, his eyes level with his daughter's. "Tell me what," happened?" he asked in a gentle voice. "It's okay. I'm not angry with you, I just want to understand." The twins looked at each other in a silent communication they had always shared. It was Marina who spoke first, always the braver one. "Felicity said we needed to learn to be independent," she began hesitantly. "She said you were too busy to worry about our fussiness. The day after you left, she took our phones and said we couldn't bother you with calls anymore." "And Vanessa?" Edward asked, referring to the housekeeper who had worked for the family for years. "Felicity said she had to leave to take care of her sick mother," Beatrice replied. "But before she left, Vanessa cried a lot and hugged us. She tried to call you, but Felicity took the phone." Edward felt a wave of nausea. How had he not noticed any of this happening? How could he have been so blind? "What about the food?" he asked, fearing the answer. "We can only eat what Felicity leaves," Marina explained. "She keeps everything in the locked fridge downstairs in the kitchen. In the morning she leaves us some cereal, and at night sometimes there's a little bit of dinner left over. Sometimes there's nothing left," Beatrice added, her voice choked. "Then we get very hungry. And Mrs. Eleanor started giving us food when she saw us in the garden," Marina continued. "But Felicity found out and said, if we kept bothering the neighbors, you'd send us to a boarding school far from here." Edward felt his eyes sting. Pain and guilt mixed with growing anger. How could he have let this happen? "Can I see these drawings?" he asked, pointing to the pile in the corner. Marina hesitated for a moment, but then got up and picked up the papers. Edward carefully unfolded them. They were typical children's drawings: colorful houses, families holding hands, tables full of food. In one of them, there were 3 smiling figures, a tall man and 2 small girls, in front of a huge house. There was no sign of Felicity in that happy drawing. "Why are they crumpled?" Edward asked. "Felicity said I draw badly," Beatrice replied, looking at the floor. "She said it was baby stuff, and no one wanted to see it." Edward hugged his daughters tightly, letting some tears escape. He felt like the worst father in the world, unable to protect his own daughters within his own home. "This ends now," he promised, his voice firm. "No one will ever treat you like this again. Never again." The girls remained in his arms for a long time, as if fearing that if they let go he might disappear again. Edward knew he had a lot of work ahead of him to regain his daughter's trust, to heal the wounds his negligence had allowed to open. "Let's take a warm bath and put on clean pajamas," he suggested finally. "Then we'll go downstairs and make the best pasta bake London has ever seen. What do you think?" The shy smiles he received in response were like little rays of sunshine amidst the storm brewing in his heart. Edward helped the girls with their bath, found clean pajamas at the back of the wardrobe, and carefully combed their brown hair, making the braids they loved so much. While the girls were getting ready, Edward went to his room, ignoring Felicity, who was talking on the phone in the living room. He opened the built-in safe in the wall and took out some important documents. Then he called 3 people: his lawyer, a private investigator recommended by a friend from the National Police Force, and Vanessa, the former housekeeper. None of the calls took more than 5 minutes, but all had the same purpose: to understand what had happened and ensure justice was done. When he went down to the kitchen with the girls, he found Felicity pouring herself a glass of expensive wine, looking bored. "Shouldn't you be in bed?" she asked upon seeing the twins, not hiding her distaste. "We're making pasta," Edward replied, keeping his voice casual as he opened the fridge, and began to separate ingredients. Felicity laughed, a melodious but cold sound. "You, cooking?" "Don't be ridiculous, Edward. We have an image to maintain. If you want the girls to eat something, order room service." Edward continued his task, ignoring the comment. "By the way, where's the key to the downstairs kitchen fridge?" he asked, as if casually. He saw Felicity freeze for a second before regaining her composure. "What nonsense is that? Nobody locks fridges," she replied with a forced smile. "Are the girls making up stories again?" Edward merely stared at her in silence as he opened drawers and cupboards. In a few minutes he found the key hidden in a tea tin that Felicity always reserved for her personal use. Without saying a word, he took it and headed to the auxiliary kitchen downstairs, leaving a visibly disturbed Felicity behind. The utility kitchen was spacious and well-equipped, but rarely used since Felicity had taken over the house. Edward opened the locked fridge and felt a new wave of anger. It was overflowing with food, fresh fruits, vegetables, meats, dairy products, juices and even sweets. Things that apparently his daughters were not allowed to consume. He filled a basket with some items and returned to the main kitchen, where Marina and Beatrice awaited him, sitting at the table, watching Felicity with apprehensive looks. The woman, in turn, appeared to be sending frantic messages on her phone. Edward placed the basket on the counter and began preparing the pasta bake, involving the girls in the process. Gradually he saw the fear in their eyes replaced by small sparks of joy as they broke the spaghetti, tasted the sauce, and grated the cheese. Felicity remained in the adjacent room, observing the scene with an increasingly somber expression. When dinner was ready, Edward served generous plates for his daughters and one for himself. The girls ate with such enthusiasm that they barely talked, confirming to Edward how hungry they were. "You need to learn good manners," Felicity commented from the doorway, observing the girls with disdain. "You're eating like savages." Edward placed his fork beside his plate, staring at his wife with a calm that hid an inner storm. "They're eating like children who have been denied food," he replied, keeping his voice low so as not to scare his daughters. "Something we will discuss privately as soon as they finish." Felicity held his gaze for a moment, then shrugged. "I don't have time for this kind of drama," she said, picking up her handbag. "I have a charity event at the club. Don't wait up for me." When she left, Edward felt the girls visibly relax. They finished dinner in a lighter mood, and he even managed to elicit some laughter by telling stories of his adventures in Europe. But his mind was working frantically, planning the next steps. After settling the twins into his own king-size bed, with the promise that they would watch a movie together, Edward began his investigation. He checked bank statements, found records of employee dismissals that had not been communicated, and discovered that the corporate card he had left for the girls' emergencies had been blocked. On Felicity's phone, which she had left charging on the bedside table, he found revealingly cruel messages about his stepdaughters. Later, when the girls were sleeping soundly, curled up together, Edward sat on the veranda with a cup of coffee, looking out at the London night. On the table in front of him, a pile of evidence began to tell a story of neglect and cruelty he had never imagined possible within his own home. Beside him, the phone rang. It was the investigator, with news that only confirmed his suspicions. Felicity had a history. "Mr. Morrison," said the grave voice on the other end of the line, "you need to know that your wife has been accused of similar behavior before. In her previous marriage, her ex-husband's son—" Edward closed his eyes, feeling the weight of guilt on his shoulders. He had brought this woman into his home, close to his daughters. He had trusted her, and this mistake had almost cost him what was most precious. "Continue the investigation," he requested. "I want everything documented, every detail." As he hung up, he looked at the photo of the twins in his wallet. He would do whatever it took to protect them, and most importantly, he would never again be an absent father, incapable of seeing the suffering etched in his own children's eyes. The London night continued its course, indifferent to the drama unfolding in that Belgravia mansion. But for Edward Morrison, nothing would ever be the same. A transformation had begun in the man, in the father, and in the empire he had built. Now it remained to be seen how far he would have to go to ensure his daughters never again faced the horror they endured in his absence. The days that followed were a period of intense transformation for Edward. The entrepreneur who once delegated domestic matters to others now personally took charge of every aspect of Marina and Beatrice's lives. He woke up early every morning to prepare breakfast, took the girls to school, helped with homework, and tucked them into bed with impromptu stories. Between meetings, he found time to attend school presentations and medical appointments that had been neglected during his absence. Biotech Global, his company employing over 200 staff and moving millions, now operated on reduced hours for its founder and CEO. Edward reorganized his schedule, transferred some responsibilities to his directors, and worked remotely whenever possible. The man who once lived for business now understood that his greatest investment should be in his daughters. Felicity, meanwhile, kept her distance. After the initial confrontation on the night of Edward's return, she adopted a defensive stance, claiming the girls exaggerated their complaints and that he was being manipulated by the fertile imagination of spoiled children. She continued, to leave early and return late, always impeccable, always distant. The marriage, which was already more about appearances than affection, was now reduced to a social contract on the verge of being broken. In his penthouse office in the glass-fronted building in Canary Wharf, Edward received the preliminary reports from the private investigator, Robert Sutton, a discreet and meticulous man who had worked for years in the National Police Force before opening his own agency. "You need to see this," Robert said, placing a folder containing documents and some photographs on the dark wooden table. "I managed to trace your wife's complete history." Edward opened the folder with apprehension. The first pages contained records of a previous lawsuit filed against Felicity by her ex-husband, Augustus Reeves, a property developer. The lawsuit, which never went to trial, accused Felicity of negligence and psychological mistreatment against Augustus's son, then a 10-year-old boy. The case had been closed with a confidential settlement that, according to Robert's investigations, involved a considerable sum. "How did no one discover this before?" Edward asked, feeling his stomach churn. "The case was sealed, and the records were practically erased," Robert explained. "The ex-husband signed a confidentiality agreement, probably to protect his son from exposure. Also, her name was different at the time, Felicity Miller, not Felicity Hayes, as she presents herself now." Edward continued to leaf through the documents, finding records of the boy's hospitalizations for mild malnutrition and anxiety disorders. There were also testimonies from former household staff that corroborated the pattern of neglect, locked food, disproportionate punishments, social isolation. "There's more," Robert continued, indicating another set of documents. "I managed to locate some of the staff who were dismissed from your home in recent months. They all tell similar stories. They were dismissed for disobedience when they tried to feed the girls outside the times set by Felicity." Edward took a deep breath, trying to control the anger building within him. "And Vanessa? My former housekeeper?" "She's in Guildford, at her sister's house," Robert replied. "According to her, she was fired the day after your trip, when she questioned why Felicity was locking up the food. She tried to contact you, but all the numbers she had were blocked. She also mentions that Felicity threatened her with a libel suit if she tried to spread lies." Edward shook his head, feeling the weight of guilt. How could he have been so blind? How had he not noticed the signs? "And the security cameras at the house," he asked, remembering the system he had installed years ago, more as a precaution than out of real necessity. "That's interesting," Robert commented, adjusting his glasses. "The system was deactivated approximately 3 months ago, shortly after the wedding. The security company received a formal request, apparently signed by you, asking to cancel the service." Edward frowned. He had never signed such a document. "I want the system reinstated immediately," he ordered. "But discreetly. Cameras in common areas, continuous recording, remote, access only for me." Robert nodded, making notes. "One more thing," Edward continued. "I need you to contact my lawyer, Maurice Campbell. I want you to work together to prepare a lawsuit. I'm seeking full custody of the girls and a restraining order against Felicity." "I understand," Robert replied, "but I must warn you, cases like this can be complicated. Your wife is well connected, has an impeccable public image. It will be your word against hers, unless we have concrete evidence." "Then find that evidence," Edward retorted with determination, "whatever it takes." That same afternoon, picking the girls up from school, Edward noticed how his relationship with them was strengthening. Marina and Beatrice ran to him at the gate, genuine smiles lighting up their faces. Their teacher, Denise, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, approached with an expression of relief. "Mr. Morrison, it's good to see you," she greeted him. "The girls are different this week. Happier, more engaged. Whatever has changed at home, it's doing them good." Edward felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you for noticing," he replied. "We're spending more time together." Denise hesitated for a moment, as if pondering whether she should continue. "You know, During your trip, I noticed some irregularities, she said finally. The girls came without snacks, sometimes without proper school supplies. I tried to contact your wife, but she never returned my calls. Edward pressed his lips together, feeling the anger return. Why didn't you contact me directly? He asked, trying not to sound accusatory. I tried, Denise explained. I called your personal phone and the office several times. They always told me you were in a meeting or unavailable. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Felicity had blocked all communication channels that could have alerted him to what was happening in his absence. I appreciate your concern, Denise, Edward said sincerely, and I apologize for not being accessible when I should have been. This will not happen again. On the way back home, Edward took the girls for ice cream at a traditional ice cream parlor in Belgravia. As they enthusiastically enjoyed their sundaes, he watched them with a mixture of love and sorrow. How could he have left them vulnerable? How had he not noticed the subtle changes that now seemed so obvious? Dad, Marina called, interrupting his thoughts. Is Felicity leaving our house? Edward swallowed hard. He hadn't expected such a direct question. Why do you ask that, darling? Because you look angry with her, the girl replied, and she looks angry with you too. You don't talk anymore. Edward considered how to answer. He didn't want to lie to his daughters, but he also didn't want to expose them to more stress than they had already faced. Sometimes adults go through difficult times in relationships, he explained carefully. We're trying to solve some problems. I don't like her, Beatrice declared with the characteristic sincerity of her 7 years. She's mean when you're not looking. Edward felt a tightening in his chest. What matters now is that we're together, he said, trying to smile, and I promise I will always protect you. Nothing bad will happen again. When they returned to the mansion, they found the discreet security team Robert had hired. 2 technicians were installing new cameras at strategic points in the house, while an IT specialist configured the system for real-time transmission to Edward's phone. Felicity was not home, as usual. Edward took the opportunity to take the girls to the office of Maurice Campbell, his lawyer and longtime friend. The law firm occupied the top 2 floors of a modern building in Mayfair, overlooking Hyde Park. Maurice greeted them personally, with his characteristic reassuring smile. While the twins distracted themselves in the waiting room, equipped with children's books and a video game console, Edward and Maurice spoke behind closed doors. I've read the investigators' reports, Maurice began, adjusting his navy blue tie. We have a solid case for full custody, Edward, but we need to proceed with caution. Felicity has important connections, including some judges. I don't care about her connections, Edward retorted. I just want my daughters safe. And they will be, Maurice assured him. But we need to be strategic. The first step is to collect more evidence. The cameras will help. I also suggest we find a child psychologist to assess the girls, not to pressure them, but to professionally document the emotional impact of what they've experienced. Edward nodded, although the idea of exposing his daughters to yet another stranger asking questions bothered him. We'll need a medical examination too, Maurice continued. We don't expect to find physical signs of abuse, but malnutrition and stress can have documentable impacts. I'm worried about their well-being, Edward admitted. All this process, the questions, the exams, I don't want to traumatize them further. I understand your concern, Maurice said gently, but, unfortunately, the system requires concrete evidence. I promise we'll do everything as non-invasively as possible. Dr. Richard Mills is an excellent pediatrician, specializing in child neglect cases, and Dr. Louisa Parker is an incredible psychologist with children. Both know how to proceed with sensitivity. Edward reluctantly agreed. He would do whatever was necessary to ensure his daughter's long-term safety, even if it meant some immediate discomfort. Back at the mansion, Edward found Vanessa waiting on the veranda. The housekeeper, a 50-year-old woman with a kind face framed by graying hair, had tears in her eyes when the girls ran to hug her. "My little ones," she exclaimed, kneeling to envelop them in her sturdy arms. "How I've missed you." Edward watched the scene with emotion. Vanessa had worked for the family since the twins were born. She was more than an employee. She was part of that unconventional family. "Come in, Vanessa," Edward invited. "We have a lot to talk about." Sitting on the back veranda, while the girls played in the garden under the watchful eye of a discreetly positioned security guard, Vanessa recounted the events that led to her dismissal. "It was the day after your trip, Mr. Edward," she began, her hands clasped in her lap. "Mrs. Felicity called me into the office and said my services were no longer needed. When I questioned it, she became furious, saying I was overstepping my bounds, that the house was hers now." Edward shook his head, indignant. "Why didn't you contact me directly?" "I tried, sir. I called your phone several times, sent messages. When I got no reply, I went to the company. The secretary said you had left. Express orders not to be disturbed with domestic matters during your trip." Another lie from Felicity. Edward had never given such an order. "What else happened while I was away?" he asked, fearing the answer. Vanessa took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "At first, Mrs. Felicity kept up appearances. The girls went to school, had their meals, though increasingly restricted. But soon after I left, I learned from Rose, the cleaner, that the situation worsened. Felicity hired a cleaning company instead of regular staff. Different people came each day, no one who could form a bond with the girls or notice what was happening." "And the food?" Edward asked, remembering the locked fridge. "Rose told me Felicity started controlling everything. She set strict meal times, minimal quantities. If the girls didn't eat exactly what she dictated, they got nothing until the next meal. And when Felicity went out, which was frequent, she left nothing prepared." Edward closed his eyes for a moment, imagining his hungry, confused daughters, not understanding why life had changed so drastically. "Why, Vanessa?" he asked finally. "Why would anyone do that to children?" The housekeeper sighed. "Some say it's control, Mr. Edward. Others talk about envy. Perhaps Mrs. Felicity can't stand sharing your attention with the girls, or perhaps—" She hesitated. "Perhaps what?" Edward encouraged. "Perhaps she doesn't see them as a real family," Vanessa completed. "Perhaps for her, the girls are just an obstacle between you and the life she envisioned for the two of you." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the electronic gate opening. Felicity's car, a white Porsche Cayenne, entered the property. The girls immediately stopped playing and approached their father, as if seeking protection. "Go inside with the girls, Vanessa," Edward requested, standing up. "Show them her new books we bought today." When Felicity entered the house, she found Edward in the main living room, reviewing documents with apparent tranquility. She paused for a moment, observing him with a calculating expression. "You had new cameras installed," she commented, placing her handbag on the sofa. "Any specific reason for such sudden security?" "Precaution," Edward replied, without looking up from the papers. "You never know what might happen when we're away." Felicity poured herself a gin and sat in the opposite armchair, watching her husband with an artificial smile. "I saw Vanessa's car outside," she said, with feigned casualness. "I thought she had resigned." "How interesting," Edward retorted, finally looking at her, "because she told me a very different story." Felicity's eyes narrowed slightly, but her composure did not change. "Employees always try to play the victim when they're dismissed for incompetence," she commented, shrugging. "I thought a businessman like you would understand that." "I certainly do," Edward agreed, keeping his voice controlled. "Just as I understand forgery of signatures, misappropriation of corporate cards, and of course child neglect." Felicity froze, the glass halfway to her mouth. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Edward replied, putting the documents back in the folder. "I'm just curious if it was different with Augustus's son, or if you always follow the same pattern." The mention of her ex-husband made Felicity visibly pale, but she quickly recovered. "I don't know who has been poisoning your mind with lies, Edward," she said, her voice now laden with studied emotion. "But I am deeply hurt that you believe them. I have dedicated myself to raising your daughters as if they were my own. If I made mistakes, it was out of inexperience, not malice." Edward watched the performance with a mixture of disgust and fascination. Felicity was truly good at manipulating emotions and distorting reality. "Let's clarify a few things," he said, standing up. "First, my daughters were not being raised by you. They were being systematically neglected. Second, I no longer accept lies. I have enough evidence to prosecute you for neglect, forgery, and emotional abuse. And third, I want you out of this house by tomorrow." Felicity's eyes widened, dropping her mask of perfection for a moment. "You can't kick me out of my own house," she exclaimed, indignant. "This house is in my name," Edward corrected, "as is everything in it, including that collection of Hermes handbags you love to flaunt. You'll regret this," she threatened, standing up too. "I have powerful friends, Edward, people who can destroy you and that little tech company of yours with a single phone call." Edward smiled humorlessly. "Those threats might work with smaller businessmen, Felicity, not with me. Now I suggest you start packing. Security will accompany you to ensure you only take what truly belongs to you." That night, Edward dined with the girls and Vanessa, who had agreed to return to work for the family. The atmosphere was one of cautious joy, as if everyone feared that normality might be only temporary. Felicity had locked herself in the guest room, refusing to come out or speak to anyone. Later, while the girls slept, Edward received a call from Robert, the investigator. "I have news, Mr. Morrison," he said. "I found 2 more families with similar stories, one in Manchester, another in Edinburgh. Different names, but the same woman, your wife. In both cases, she approached wealthy men with children, married quickly, and then began a pattern of isolation and neglect with the children." Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. "Did any of these cases go to trial?" "No," Robert replied. "All ended in confidential settlements. The fathers, apparently, preferred to protect their children from public scrutiny rather than seek public justice." "I understand," Edward murmured thoughtfully. "Keep investigating. I want to understand what we're up against." As he hung up, Edward went to the girls' room. Marina and Beatrice slept soundly, cuddled together as they always had since they were babies. He watched them for a long moment, vowing to himself that nothing and no one would make them suffer again. The next morning, Edward took the girls for a consultation with Dr. Richard Mills, as recommended by his lawyer. The pediatrician, a 60-year-old man with kind eyes and a neatly trimmed grey beard, examined them thoroughly, maintaining a casual conversation that put them at ease. "They are underweight for their age," he informed Edward when they were alone in his office. "It's nothing critical, but it's significant, considering they were at ideal weight in their checkup 6 months ago. I also noted signs of vitamin deficiency and mild anemia, consistent with an inadequate diet." Edward nodded gravely. "Will they recover completely?" "Physically, yes, without a doubt," the doctor assured him. "With proper nutrition and vitamin supplementation, they should return to normal in a few weeks. Emotionally, however, I strongly recommend the psychological support your lawyer mentioned. The trauma of neglect can leave marks that go beyond the physical." Edward thanked him and, following the recommendations, took the girls for a session with Dr. Louisa Parker that same afternoon. The psychologist, specialized in child trauma, created a welcoming environment where the twins could express themselves through drawings and play. Meanwhile, Edward anxiously awaited in the waiting room, fearing what the professional would discover. "Your daughters are incredibly resilient, Mr. Morrison," Dr. Louisa said at the end of the session. "Despite what they've been through, they maintain a remarkable capacity to trust and connect. The bond between them served as an important protective factor during this difficult period." "And what should I do now?" Edward asked, feeling completely out of his comfort zone. Business, technology, investments, these were territories he dominated, but caring for the emotional well-being of 2 traumatized children, he was navigating blind. "Keep doing exactly what you're doing," the psychologist replied with a gentle smile. "Be present. Be consistent. Listen carefully. Children need security and predictability, especially after experiences like this. And of course, I recommend regular sessions to help them process what they've lived through in a healthy way." Upon returning home, Edward was informed by security that Felicity had left with 3 large suitcases and had not returned. However, she had not taken all her belongings, which suggested she planned to return. An envelope had been left on the hall table, addressed to Edward. Inside, a formal document from her lawyer, claiming he had no legal right to expel her from the marital residence and demanding significant financial compensation. To end the marriage, without scandal. Edward merely smiled as he read the veiled threat. Felicity clearly hadn't understood who she was dealing with. He wasn't just another rich businessman who would pay any price to avoid public exposure. He was a father determined to protect his daughters whatever the cost. That night, while preparing dinner with the girls, an activity that had quickly become a family ritual, Edward received a message from Maurice. The lawyer had secured a preliminary hearing with Judge Claudia Mills for the following week. It was a rare and valuable opportunity, likely a result of Maurice's connections within the judicial system. "We need to be completely prepared," Maurice warned over the phone. "Judge Mills is known for being rigorous but fair. If we present convincing evidence, we can get a temporary restraining order while the main case proceeds." Edward agreed, feeling a mixture of hope and apprehension. The battle was just beginning, and he knew Felicity wouldn't give up easily. But looking at Marina and Beatrice, who were now laughing as they mixed ingredients for a chocolate cake, he was sure that any fight was worth it for them. The night wore on. In London and in the Belgravia mansion, a broken family began to rebuild, while the shadow of a legal battle approached. Edward knew the path would be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, he felt he was moving in the right direction. The direction that brought him closer to his daughters, to a present fatherhood he had neglected in the name of professional success. And as the twins slept peacefully in his bed that night, Edward had realized they still feared being alone. He made a silent promise. He would never again allow work, money, or anyone else to come between him and what truly mattered. His financial empires could wait. His daughters could not. The next morning, Edward woke early to prepare a special breakfast for the girls. Pancakes with chocolate sauce, fresh fruit, and natural orange juice. As he set the table, his phone rang. It was Robert again. "Mr. Morrison," the investigator said, with urgency in his voice, "I think I've discovered something you need to know immediately. Your wife, Felicity, was in frequent contact with one of Biotech Global's main competitors. I found suspicious bank transfers and emails suggesting she might be passing on confidential information." Edward felt his blood run cold. The situation was even more complex than he had imagined. "I'm on my way to your office," he said, hanging up. The battle against Felicity had just gained a new dimension, and Edward needed to be ready for whatever came next. It wasn't just for his daughters now, it was also for his life's work, for the company he had built from scratch, and for the employees who depended on him. As he got the girls ready for another day of school, Edward thought about how to protect them from the approaching tsunami. They had already suffered too much and deserved a normal childhood, free from courts, lawyers, and scandals. Somehow, he would find a balance between fighting for justice and preserving the newfound peace in his home. As soon as he dropped the girls off at school, Edward drove directly to Robert Sutton's office, located in a discreet commercial building in the Gardens area. The investigator awaited him with a grave expression, a folder of documents open on the dark wooden table. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," Robert greeted him, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Edward sat down, dispensing with formalities. "Show me what you found." Robert nodded and pushed some printed documents towards Edward. Over the last 6 months, Felicity maintained regular contact with Mark Vincent, CEO of MedTech Solutions, the investigator explained. "As you know, MedTech is your main competitor in the field of artificial intelligence applied to medicine." Edward knew Mark Vincent well, a former university colleague who had become a fierce business rival, always one step behind Biotech Global, always trying to replicate its innovations. "The contacts began as apparent social gatherings," Robert continued, pointing to photographs taken at charity events and luxurious restaurants. "But they soon evolved into something more significant." The investigator then showed bank statements from an account in the Cayman Islands, registered under the name of a shell company. Regular deposits, always for the same amount, $200,000. "We managed to link this account to Felicity through documents found in her lawyer's office," Robert explained. "She took precautions, but not enough." Edward examined the documents, feeling a mixture of anger and disbelief. It wasn't enough that she had neglected his daughters. Felicity was also betraying his professional trust. "How does this connect to the corporate espionage you mentioned?" he asked, keeping his voice controlled. Robert then showed a series of emails recovered from Felicity's personal computer, obtained when she was still living in the mansion. The messages were coded, but clearly discussed internal information from Biotech Global, projects in development, confidential negotiations, market strategies. "The most concerning thing is this," Robert said, passing a final folder to Edward. "We found evidence that Felicity had access to your personal corporate server. Apparently, she installed a keylogger program on your home laptop, which allowed her to see your passwords." Edward felt his stomach sink. He used that laptop to work from home, especially on the most confidential projects. What exactly did she manage to access? "We are still assessing the extent," Robert replied, "but we are sure she obtained information about Project Hera, at least." Project Hera was Biotech Global's latest and most revolutionary development, an advanced artificial intelligence system for early diagnosis of neurodegenerative diseases. A project that could completely transform the treatment of conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, saving countless lives and worth billions in the global market. "We need to contain this immediately," Edward said, already picking up the phone. "I'll alert our digital security team." While Edward spoke with his technology director, giving instructions for a complete scan and change of all security protocols, Robert continued analyzing documents. When Edward hung up, the investigator had another revelation. "I also discovered something about Felicity's past that may be relevant," he said hesitantly. "Before marrying Augustus Reeves, she briefly worked for a pharmaceutical company. She was fired after accusations of leaking confidential information to competitors." "Did the case go to court?" "No," Robert replied. "As seems to be the pattern in her life, everything was settled discreetly. The company didn't want the scandal, and she signed a confidentiality agreement in exchange for compensation." Edward shook his head, realizing the full picture that was forming. Felicity was not just a negligent stepmother. She was a sophisticated criminal who had turned the manipulation of wealthy men into a lucrative career. "We need solid evidence," Edward said, determined. "I want you to keep investigating, Robert. Every penny, every email, every contact. When we take this to court, I want an irrefutable case." The investigator nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "There's one more thing you should know," he added hesitantly. "We found indications that Felicity is planning something big. She has booked flights abroad for 2 weeks from now. Paris with a connection to a still unidentified destination." Edward frowned. 2 weeks was exactly the time remaining until the official launch of Project Hera at the International Medical Technology Conference in New York. "She's planning to flee after selling the information," he concluded thoughtfully. "We need to act before that." Leaving Robert's office, Edward headed directly to Biotech Global headquarters. The glass and steel building in Canary Wharf, with its 20 floors and the company's minimalist logo on the facade, normally filled him with pride. Today, however, he felt only a frantic urgency. In his penthouse office, he gathered his trusted team: Raphael Taylor, Technology Director, Lucy Davies, Legal Director, and Peter Grant, Head of Corporate Security. He presented the situation directly, showing the evidence Robert had collected. "We need an immediate response," Edward concluded. "Project Hera is compromised, and we don't know exactly how much Felicity has already revealed to competitors." Raphael was the first to speak, adjusting his thick-framed glasses. "Technically, we can modify key aspects of the algorithm," he suggested. "It wouldn't be a complete reinvention, but enough to make any leaked information obsolete or, at least, incomplete." "How long would that take?" Edward asked. "With the entire team focused on it, perhaps a week," Raphael replied. "But it would be a Herculean effort, and we would have to postpone the launch." Lucy, always pragmatic, intervened. "From a legal standpoint, we have 2 fronts to consider," she explained. "First, intellectual property infringement and corporate espionage, which are serious crimes. Second, the issue of your daughter's custody and the proven neglect." "I don't want these matters to mix," Edward warned. "The absolute priority is my daughters. I don't want them dragged into a corporate scandal." "Understandable," Lucy agreed. "But the cases are inevitably connected. If we prove Felicity was spying on your company, it strengthens the argument that she married you with premeditated intentions, which can positively influence the custody case. Peter, silent until then, spoke up. "I suggest a two-step approach," he said, with the precision of someone who has dealt with crisis situations before. First, containment. We change what's necessary in Project Hera, reinforce security, prepare a response if leaked information appears on the market. Second, counterattack. We gather all evidence against Felicity and Mark Vincent and legally corner them. Edward nodded, thoughtfully. "Implement the containment measures immediately," he ordered. "As for the counterattack, I need to coordinate with Maurice and Robert. I want a unified strategy that protects both the company and my daughters." The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with detailed plans being drawn up and responsibilities distributed. When everyone left, Edward remained in his office, looking out at the London skyline through the wide windows. He had built an empire, gained worldwide recognition, accumulated a considerable fortune. But now all that seemed small compared to the safety and happiness of Marina and Beatrice. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Denise, the girl's teacher. "Mr. Morrison," she said, with a tone of urgency that made Edward straighten in his chair. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I thought you should know. Your wife, Felicity, showed up at school a short while ago, trying to take the girls out before dismissal." Edward felt his blood run cold. "What, are they okay?" he asked, already grabbing his car keys. "Yes, they are," Denise assured him. "Following your instructions, we did not allow them to leave with anyone other than you or Vanessa. Felicity became quite agitated, but eventually left when we threatened to call security." "I'm on my way," Edward said, hanging up. On the way to school, 1,000 scenarios flashed through his mind. What if Felicity tried again? What if she managed to take the girls? The thought of losing his daughters was unbearable. He arrived at school in record time, ignoring traffic lights and speed limits. In the secretary's office, he found Marina and Beatrice waiting, accompanied by Denise and the headmaster, a middle-aged man with a worried expression. "Daddy!" the twins exclaimed upon seeing him running into his arms. Edward hugged them tightly, feeling his heart return to a normal rhythm just by having them safe with him. "It's all right, my princesses," he assured them, kissing the tops of their heads. "Daddy's here." The headmaster approached, extending his hand. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Charles Reeves, the headmaster of the school. We need to discuss today's incident." Edward nodded, asking the girls to wait for him in the reception area, where they could see him through the glass. In the headmaster's office, Charles explained the situation in more detail. "Your wife arrived quite agitated, demanding to take the girls for an emergency medical appointment," he reported. "When we questioned the nature of the emergency, she became evasive. Following protocol and your specific instructions, we informed her that we would only release the children to authorized persons." "I appreciate your prudence," Edward said sincerely. "Mr. Morrison," Charles continued with a grave expression, "we have worked with children for many years. We recognize risk situations. Your wife seemed unstable. As a precaution, we filed a report of the incident and alerted our psychology team to speak with your daughters, just to ensure they are emotionally well." Edward swallowed hard, aware that the problem was becoming public, affecting more and more aspects of the girls' lives. "I understand and appreciate it," he replied. "We are going through a difficult time as a family. My wife and I are separating, and there are complex issues involved." Charles nodded, understanding. "If I may make a suggestion, it would be prudent to obtain a formal protective order," he said. "This would give the school legal backing to prevent any future attempts." "We are already working on that," Edward assured him. "In the meantime, can I trust the school to keep the girls safe?" "Absolutely," Charles guaranteed. "We have already reinforced security and alerted all staff. Your daughters will not leave here with anyone other than the people expressly authorized by you." Leaving the school with the girls, Edward immediately called Maurice, reporting the incident. The lawyer promised to expedite the protective order request, arguing that Felicity's attempt to remove the children without authorization constituted a real risk to their safety. "I'll file the request today," Maurice guaranteed. "With luck, we'll get an emergency hearing tomorrow." Edward took the girls home, where he found Vanessa waiting anxiously. The housekeeper had been alerted about the incident at school and had prepared the twins' favorite snack to comfort them. While the children ate in the kitchen, Edward and Vanessa spoke in low voices in the adjacent room. "I can't leave them alone for a minute," Edward said, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "Felicity is clearly willing to do anything." "Don't worry, sir," Vanessa assured him. "I won't leave their side, and the security guards are alert 24 hours a day." Edward nodded, grateful for the housekeeper's loyalty. He had hired a private security team to monitor the house and accompany the girls on all their movements, a precaution that would have seemed excessive before but now proved essential. That night, after putting the girls to bed, Edward received Maurice and Robert for an emergency meeting in his home office. The lawyer brought promising news. "I secured a hearing with Judge Mills for tomorrow at 10 in the morning," he announced. "It's a rare opportunity, Edward. We need to be impeccably prepared." "What will the judge want to see?" Edward asked. "Concrete evidence of risk," Maurice replied. "The incident at school helps, but we need more. Medical and psychological reports, testimonies, anything that demonstrates Felicity poses a danger to the girls." Robert intervened. "I have the testimonies of the former employees, medical records showing the girls' weight loss, and reports from the recently installed cameras documenting Felicity's erratic behavior in recent days." "We also have her history," Edward added. "The previous cases of neglect, the confidential settlements." "That's delicate," Maurice warned. "Since those cases were closed with confidentiality agreements, we technically cannot use them as direct evidence. But we can mention patterns of behavior, especially if we can get some of the previous victims to agree to testify." The three men worked late into the night, organizing documents, preparing arguments, anticipating possible strategies. From Felicity's defense, when Maurice and Robert finally left, Edward was exhausted but determined. Before going to bed, he went to the girls' room. Marina and Beatrice slept soundly, cuddled together as always. Edward sat on the edge of the bed, watching them in silence. How was it possible that in his pursuit of professional achievements, he had almost lost what was most precious in his life? The next morning dawned grey in London, with a fine drizzle that seemed to reflect the tension of the day beginning. Edward put on his best suit, a navy blue Armani reserved for the most important negotiations. Today he wouldn't be negotiating contracts or mergers, but the future of his daughters. Marina and Beatrice, already informed about the hearing, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, even with their limited understanding due to age. They were silent during breakfast, responding with monosyllables to Vanessa's attempts to cheer them up. "Everything will be all right, my little ones," Edward promised, kneeling to be at his daughter's eye level. "Daddy will make sure no one hurts you again." "Is Felicity leaving forever?" Beatrice asked, her big eyes fixed on her father. "That's what we're going to decide today," Edward replied sincerely. "But whatever happens, you will be safe, I promise." Marina, always the more perceptive of the two, touched her father's face with her small hand. "Don't be sad, Daddy," she said, with wisdom beyond her 7 years. "We're okay now that you're back." Edward felt his eyes well up and hugged his daughters tightly. How could he have been so blind? How had he not realized the treasure he had? On the way to the Royal Courts of Justice, Edward received a call from Raphael, his technology director. The news was not good. "We just identified a massive security breach," Raphael reported, his voice tense. "Someone remotely accessed the central server of Project Hera yesterday morning. We are tracing the origin, but indications point to a sophisticated operation." "Felicity?" Edward asked, though he already knew the answer. "Probably not alone," Raphael replied. "This requires significant technical expertise. We suspect collaboration with MedTech's technology team." Edward closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the impact of the news. How much was compromised? "We are assessing, but it seems substantial," Raphael admitted. "Possibly the core of the predictive algorithm, the most valuable part of the project." "Implement the containment protocol immediately," Edward ordered, "and prepare for the contingency plan we discussed. We'll talk more after the hearing." As he hung up, Edward tried to reorganize his thoughts. The situation was deteriorating rapidly on all fronts. But now he would focus all his energy on the most important battle, the protection of his daughters. The Royal Courts of Justice in London was an imposing building in the city centre, its classical architecture contrasting with the modern skyscrapers around it. Edward met Maurice at the entrance, and together they ascended to the courtroom where Judge Claudia Mills awaited them for the emergency hearing. To Edward's surprise, Felicity was already there, accompanied by a stern-looking lawyer whom he recognized as Gregory Miller, known for defending celebrities and businessmen in high-profile divorce cases. Felicity was impeccably dressed in a conservative grey suit, without excessive makeup, her hair pulled back in a discreet bun, the perfect image of a dedicated wife and stepmother. Judge Mills, a woman in her 50s with short grey hair and keen eyes, observed everyone with a neutral expression as they entered. "Good morning, everyone," she greeted in a firm voice. "We are here to evaluate the request for a protective order in favour of the minors Marina and Beatrice Morrison against their stepmother, Felicity Hayes Morrison. We will conduct this with the seriousness and decorum that the case demands." The hearing began with Maurice presenting the case, the evidence of neglect, the testimonies of the employees, the medical and psychological reports, the incident at school. Edward watched Felicity's expression gradually transform, the confident smile giving way to visible tension as the evidence accumulated against her. When it was his turn to speak, Gregory Miller adopted the expected strategy. He tried to portray Felicity as a dedicated but inexperienced stepmother, unjustly accused by a controlling husband and rebellious daughters who did not accept her authority. "Your Honor," he argued, his voice modulated to convey restrained indignation, "what we have here is a classic case of rejection of a surrogate mother figure. The girls, understandably attached to the memory of their biological mother, resist any attempt by Mrs. Hayes to impose healthy boundaries and necessary discipline." Edward felt his blood boil at hearing that absolute distortion of reality, but Maurice placed a hand on his arm, a silent reminder to maintain composure. Judge Mills listened to both sides carefully, making occasional notes and interrupting only to ask for clarification. When it was time for Felicity to testify, she played her role perfectly, her voice choked, her eyes tearful, the posture of a misunderstood victim. "I just tried to be the mother they needed," she declared with apparent emotion. "Perhaps I made mistakes, but they were mistakes of love, not neglect. Edward was always an absent father, focused on his career. When he traveled for 3 weeks, he left all responsibility with me without any support." Edward had to bite his lip not to protest at such an absolute inversion of the truth. But then the judge did something unexpected. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, deliberately using Felicity's maiden name. "I have here a confidential report that has just arrived at the court from the Manchester City Council Social Services. It mentions a previous case involving your ex-husband's son, Augustus Reeves. Would you like to comment?" Felicity visibly paled, and her lawyer immediately stood up. "Your Honor, any previous case that was closed with a confidentiality agreement should not be considered in this hearing," he protested. "It is a violation of my client's right to privacy." "Judge," Mills stared at him over her glasses. "Counselor, when it comes to the welfare of children, this court has a duty to consider all relevant facts," she replied firmly, "especially when they demonstrate a pattern of behavior." Turning back to Felicity, who now seemed to have lost all confidence, the judge continued, "I also have records here of a third similar situation in Edinburgh. It's interesting how the cases seem to follow the same script. Quick marriage to a rich and established man, followed by abusive behavior towards the children from the first marriage." Edward observed Felicity with a mixture of disgust and pity. How had he not realized who she really was? How had he let this woman into his life, into his home, near his daughters? Judge Mills reviewed her documents for a few more minutes in tense silence, then looked up at the room. "Based on the evidence presented, this court grants the protective order in favor of the minors Marina and Beatrice Morrison," she announced. "Felicity Hayes is prohibited from approaching the children within a distance of 200 meters, as well as from contacting them by any means, direct or indirect. This order is initially valid for 90 days, during which time the case will be reviewed in more detail." Edward felt such intense relief that he almost fainted. Beside him, Maurice smiled discreetly. As for the marital residence, the judge continued, Mr. Edward Morrison retains the right of exclusive occupation until the resolution of the divorce proceedings, considering that he is the legal owner of the property and that the children need stability at this delicate time. Mrs. Hayes has 48 hours to remove her personal belongings, accompanied by a bailiff. Felicity seemed in shock, as if she couldn't believe her usual script hadn't worked this time. Her lawyer whispered something in her ear, probably strategies to appeal the decision, but she seemed not to hear. At the end of the hearing, as Edward prepared to leave, Felicity stared at him with a cold hatred that made him shiver. "This isn't over, Edward," she said in a low voice so only he could hear. "You have no idea what I've set in motion." Before he could reply, her lawyer pulled her by the arm, quickly leading her away. Edward remained motionless for a moment, trying to decipher whether that had just been the outburst of a defeated woman or a real threat. "Don't worry about it," Maurice said, noticing his tension. "It's a typical reaction. She lost and is trying to maintain some sense of control." Edward nodded, but something in Felicity's voice had unsettled him. Remembering Raphael's call about the security breach, he was sure the battle was far from over. Leaving the royal courts of justice, he found Robert waiting in the car. "How did it go?" the investigator asked, anxious. "We got the protective order," Edward replied. "The girls are legally protected for now." "Excellent," Robert said, seeming genuinely relieved. "Because I have more news and it's not good." Edward got into the car, mentally preparing for another blow. "Felicity is not acting alone," Robert explained, showing photographs on his tablet. "In addition to her involvement with Mark Vincent from MedTech, we've identified connections with a group of foreign investors who seem very interested in acquiring shares of Biotech Global." The photos showed Felicity in discreet meetings with foreign-looking men, in private restaurants and luxury hotel lobbies. "Who are they?" Edward asked. "Representatives of the Zhao Group, a Chinese conglomerate specializing in hostile takeovers of technology companies," Robert replied. "They have a controversial history of industrial espionage and aggressive market practices." Edward closed his eyes for a moment, understanding the magnitude of the situation. It wasn't just a resentful wife trying to harm him. It was a coordinated operation to steal his technology and possibly take over his company. "We need to act fast," he said, picking up the phone to call Raphael. "Biotech Global is under attack." As the car drove through London towards the company, Edward felt the weight of responsibilities on his shoulders. He had won the first battle for his daughter's safety, but now he faced a war on multiple fronts. His family, his company, everything he had built was at risk. Looking out the car window at the city that had welcomed him and allowed his success, Edward made a silent promise. He would not let Felicity or anyone else destroy what he had fought so hard to build. He would fight with all his strength, not just for the financial empire, but primarily for Marina and Beatrice, the true center of his universe, as he had belatedly discovered. "Exactly. Because the truth is not in what we say, but in what we do in the path we take," Edward explained. "Felicity can say whatever she wants now. She can try to convince people that she is the good one in the story. But in time, the truth always comes out, just like with the tortoise." Beatrice pondered for a moment, her little face furrowed in concentration. "So we just have to wait and keep being good girls?" "That's right," Edward confirmed, smiling. "You just keep being yourselves, keep studying, playing, growing. The people who truly matter know who you are." Marina still didn't seem entirely convinced. "But what if someone is mean to us because of what she said?" Edward hugged her tighter. "Then you tell me, or tell Vanessa, or tell Miss Denise. We will take care of you. Always. I promise." The twins seemed to calm down a bit, and Edward took the opportunity to suggest an activity he knew would distract them, making chocolate chip cookies. Cooking together had become a ritual that strengthened their bonds, and in some way, healed invisible wounds. In the kitchen, while the girls measured ingredients and mixed the dough with childlike enthusiasm, Edward received a message from Robert. The investigator had found something they needed to discuss, urgently. Edward replied that he would meet him after the children were asleep. The rest of the afternoon passed in relative normalcy, with Edward making a conscious effort to create a light and safe environment for his daughters. They played board games, watched an animated movie, and he helped them with their homework. With each smile, each carefree laugh from the girls, Edward felt that, despite everything, they were on the right track. When he finally managed to put the twins to bed, Robert was already waiting for him in the office. The investigator looked more serious than usual. "Thank you for coming so late," Edward said, offering the man a coffee. "What I have to show couldn't wait," Robert replied, politely declining the drink and opening his laptop. On the screen, surveillance images appeared, showing Felicity in meetings with different people over the past few months. Edward recognized some: Mark Vincent from MedTech, representatives from the Zhao Group, well-known lawyers and journalists, but one figure in particular caught his attention. "This is," Edward began, incredulous. "Yes, Andrew Carter, your financial director," Robert confirmed. They had at least 7 meetings in the last 3 months, all in discreet locations, all carefully planned to avoid detection. Edward felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. Andrew was his right-hand man, his university friend, someone he implicitly trusted. The betrayal was incomprehensible. "Are you sure?" he asked, still trying to process the information. "Absolutely," Robert replied. "And there's more. I found significant transactions from an offshore account linked to the Zhao Group to another in the Cayman Islands, which then connects to a Swiss account registered in the name of a shell company. The ultimate beneficiary of that company, Andrew Carter." Edward ran a hand over his face, trying to organize his thoughts. Now everything made sense. How the intruders knew exactly where to look, how they had overcome certain security barriers that required internal knowledge, how certain confidential information had leaked so precisely. "It wasn't just Felicity," he murmured, more to himself than to Robert. "It was a coordinated conspiracy." "Exactly," the investigator agreed, "and that significantly changes our strategy. Felicity may be the public face, but she is just one piece of a larger puzzle." Edward stood up, walking to the window. The London night stretched before him, skyscraper lights shining like earthly stars. Somewhere in that city, people were conspiring to destroy everything he had built. "What is your recommendation?" he asked finally. "Immediate counterattack on multiple fronts," Robert replied, without hesitation. "Criminal, civil, and corporate. We have enough evidence to prosecute Andrew for industrial espionage and breach of contract, Felicity for conspiracy and unauthorized access, the Zhao Group and MedTech for predatory business practices and intellectual property infringement." Edward nodded slowly. The idea of diving into yet another battle, when he had barely achieved some stability for his daughters, was exhausting. But there was no choice. "Do whatever is necessary," he told Robert. "Work with Maurice and Lucy to coordinate the legal strategy. I want Andrew removed discreetly tomorrow, before he has a chance to cause more damage." The investigator made notes and prepared to leave. At the door, he hesitated. "One more thing, Mr. Morrison. With your permission, I'd like to reinforce the security of the house and the girls. Felicity lost in court, she's losing in public opinion, and now she may lose financially. Desperate people take desperate measures." Edward felt a shiver. The idea that Felicity might try something against his daughters out of revenge was terrifying, but it could not be dismissed. "Do what you deem necessary," he agreed, "but discreetly. I don't want to scare the girls more than they already are." After Robert left, Edward stayed awake for hours, reviewing documents and preparing for the next day. It would be one of the most difficult of his career, confronting a friend of decades about betrayal, initiating a series of high-profile lawsuits, and still maintaining normalcy for his daughters. Sometime in the early hours, exhausted, he fell asleep on his desk. He was woken by muffled giggles. Opening his eyes, he found Marina and Beatrice beside his chair, still in their pajamas, their hair messy from sleep. "Daddy fell asleep working again," Beatrice said with comical seriousness. "Just like that day we found you on the sofa with your laptop," Marina added, shaking her head like a miniature adult. Edward smiled, rubbing his eyes. "What time is it?" "Breakfast time," they answered in chorus, pulling him by the hands. In the kitchen, Vanessa was already preparing pancakes, the sweet aroma filling the air. Edward realized with a pang of guilt that he had missed his daughter's morning routine. He promised himself that no matter what happened at the company today, he would be home in time for dinner. "I promise I won't sleep in the office again," he told the girls, pouring juice into their glasses. "Pinky promise?" Beatrice asked, extending her pinky finger. "Pinky promise," Edward confirmed, intertwining his pinky finger with his daughter's and then doing the same with Marina. After breakfast, he helped the girls get ready for school. As he combed Beatrice's hair, he noticed how she seemed more relaxed, more secure. Marina, meanwhile, hummed as she packed her backpack, behavior he hadn't seen in a long time. As he dropped them off at school, where two discreetly positioned security guards ensured their protection, Edward felt a mixture of gratitude and determination. Despite all the challenges, his daughters were recovering, and that, more than anything else, gave him the strength to face what was coming. At Biotech Global, the day began with an emergency meeting of the administrative board. Edward, supported by Lucy and Peter, presented the evidence against Andrew Carter. The reaction was one of shock and indignation. Andrew was respected in the market, his reputation considered unassailable. But the evidence was damning. When the financial director arrived, he found not his usual team, but security, guards and legal representatives. He was escorted to a private room where Edward awaited him. "Why Andrew?" was all Edward could ask when they were alone. The man before him, whom he had known for over 20 years, did not seem remorseful. There was a calculating glint in his eyes that Edward had never noticed before. "Why?" Andrew repeated with a bitter laugh. "Because you always got all the credit, Edward. 20 years building this company together, and who appears in the magazines? Who gives the lectures? Who is the British tech genius?" Edward shook his head, incredulous. "We built this together, yes, and you were always recognized, rewarded. You have share ownership, annual bonuses, full autonomy in your area." "Crumbs," Andrew interrupted. "Crumbs compared to what you accumulated. Do you know how much the Zhao Group offered me to facilitate the acquisition of Biotech Global? $50 million, Edward. Enough to never have to work in anyone's shadow again. And that's why you allied with Felicity? Using my marriage, my daughters, as part of a scheme?" Andrew shrugged, a disturbing coldness in his demeanor. "It was convenient. She was already planning to bring you down anyway for her own reasons. I just optimized the process." Edward studied the man before him, trying to reconcile this version with the friend he thought he knew. Were there signs he had ignored, resentments he hadn't noticed growing over the years? "You are terminated at Biotech Global," he said finally. "Security will escort you to collect your belongings. Our lawyers will be in touch regarding the criminal and civil proceedings." Andrew did not seem surprised or particularly concerned. "You can sue me, Edward, but you can't stop what's coming. The Zhao Group doesn't give up easily. And Felicity, well, she has her own plans. For revenge." A chill ran down Edward's spine. "What do you mean by that?" Andrew smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "She knows she lost the legal battle. She knows she lost you. But there are other ways to hurt a man, aren't there?" Edward felt his blood run cold. Was Andrew implying some threat to the girls? Before he could demand clarification, the door opened and security guards entered to escort Andrew out. Immediately, Edward called Robert, then the school, then Vanessa. All confirmed that the girls were safe, protected under constant surveillance. Even so, an irrational fear took hold of him, the fear only a father can feel when his children are potentially in danger. The following hours were a whirlwind. News of Andrew's dismissal spread quickly. The market reacted nervously, with Biotech Global shares fluctuating. Economic journalists bombarded the press office with requests for information. Meanwhile, Edward coordinated with Lucy and Maurice the initiation of legal proceedings against everyone involved in the conspiracy. In the middle of the afternoon, when the corporate crisis seemed minimally under control, Edward received a call from Vanessa. "Mr. Edward," the housekeeper said, with an urgency in her voice that made his heart pound. I just received a huge bouquet of flowers here at the house. There's no card, but the delivery man insisted it was for the girls." "Don't let them touch it," Edward ordered, already grabbing his keys. "Not even you. I'm coming home now. Alert security." On the way, he called Robert again, explaining the situation. The investigator promised to immediately send a specialized team to analyze the bouquet. When he arrived home, he found a bizarre scene. A monumental bouquet of white and red flowers occupied the center of the living room, while security guards kept their distance, communicating via radios. Vanessa was with the girls in their room, following his instructions. "Where is Robert's team?" Edward asked the nearest security guard. "They just arrived, sir," the man replied, indicating a black van pulling up. From the van emerged 3 people in professional attire, carrying sophisticated equipment. They identified themselves as chemical and biological threat specialists, a precaution Edward would have found excessive in any other circumstance, but not now, not with his daughters at stake. The analysis was quick and thorough, the result surprising. "There are no harmful agents, Mr. Morrison," the team leader, a middle-aged woman with perceptive eyes, informed him. "The flowers are clean, however—" She hesitated, seeming uncomfortable. "However," Edward prompted. "We found this hidden in the center of the arrangement," she said, showing a small black device. "It's a live streaming camera and an ultra-sensitive microphone." Edward felt a wave of nausea. It wasn't an attempt to physically harm his daughters. It was something perhaps even more disturbing, an invasion, a way for Felicity to continue watching the girls, staying connected to them through a sick voyeurism. "Is she watching now?" he asked, looking at the device with repulsion. "Probably," the specialist confirmed. "The transmission is active." Edward took the device, staring directly into the small lens. "It's over, Felicity," he said, his voice firm. "You lost. In court, in public opinion, in everything. If you try something like this again, the consequences will be much worse than a simple protective order." He then handed the device back to the specialist, instructing her to preserve it as evidence for the legal proceedings. When the team left, taking the bouquet and the camera, Edward went upstairs to find his daughters. They were in Marina's room, seemingly engrossed in an elaborate game with dolls and building blocks. "Daddy!" they exclaimed upon seeing him. "You're home early." "I promised, didn't I?" he replied, smiling and sitting on the carpet beside them. "And promises are meant to be kept." "Were the flowers for us?" Beatrice asked, curious. "Vanessa didn't let us go downstairs to see." Edward hesitated, pondering how to explain the situation without scaring them. "The flowers weren't safe," he said finally. "Sometimes people we don't like try to send gifts that look pretty but aren't good for us." Marina observed him with her perceptive eyes. "Felicity sent them, didn't she?" She deduced. Edward nodded, surprised once again by his daughter's keen intuition. "She did. But we don't need to worry about that now. The flowers have been taken away, and we are all safe here." The girls seemed to accept the explanation and soon returned to their game, inviting their father to join. Edward allowed himself to be absorbed into the fanciful world they created, a world where princesses solved complex problems and there were always happy endings. That night, after dinner with his daughters, tucking them into bed and ensuring the house was secure, Edward finally had time to reflect on the tumultuous events of the past few days. In his office, reviewing documents for the lawsuits that would be filed the next day, he realized that, despite all the attacks, his position was stronger than ever. Biotech Global had overcome the initial crisis. Project Hera was safe and ready to revolutionize global medicine. His team had shown extraordinary loyalty and competence, and, most importantly, his daughters were recovering, flourishing under his newly dedicated care. Felicity, Andrew, the Zhao group, all had tried to destroy him, each for their own reasons, but what they didn't realize was that by threatening what he loved most, they only strengthened him, clarified his priorities, reconnected him with his essence. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Maurice. "I have news," the lawyer said. "Felicity took a flight to Paris 2 hours ago. Apparently, she decided the battle here was lost." Edward didn't feel the relief he expected with the news. Instead, a strange compassion washed over him. What kind of emptiness existed within Felicity for her to act that way? What kind of pain had transformed her into someone capable of mistreating innocent children? "The lawsuits continue," he told Maurice. "She can flee the UK, but not the consequences of her actions." As he hung up, Edward went to the girls' room. They slept soundly, Marina with a book still open on her chest, Beatrice hugging the teddy bear she had carried since she was a baby. He watched them for a long moment, marveling at childlike resilience, at the capacity of their small hearts to continue loving and trusting even after betrayal. Silently, he promised them and himself he would never again neglect what truly mattered. He would never again allow professional success to overshadow his most important role, that of a father. Biotech Global was a remarkable achievement, yes, but his true masterpieces were those two girls sleeping peacefully, trusting that he would protect them from any harm. In the months that followed, life found a new balance. The lawsuits progressed, with significant victories on all fronts. Felicity was convicted in absentia, her assets in the UK frozen, her name included on Interpol's wanted list for fraud and industrial espionage crimes. Andrew Carter made a plea bargain, providing crucial evidence against the Zhao Group in exchange for a reduced sentence. Project Hera launched to global acclaim, setting new parameters for preventive medicine and solidifying Biotech Global as a global leader in its segment. But Edward no longer spent 16 hours a day at the company. He had delegated responsibilities, restructured his schedule, prioritized what truly mattered. Every morning, he had breakfast with his daughters. Every evening, he dined with them and tucked them into bed. He attended school presentations, ballet classes, swimming competitions. He learned to braid hair, to identify different cartoon characters, to play video games with genuine enthusiasm. And in the process, he rediscovered the pure joy of simply being present, of watching his daughters grow, of being an integral part of their lives. One Sunday afternoon, almost a year after returning from that fateful trip to Europe, Edward watched Marina and Beatrice playing in the garden of the country house he had bought on the outskirts of London. It was a simpler place compared to the Belgravia mansion, which he had ended up selling, too many painful memories associated with those walls, but infinitely more welcoming. Vanessa approached, bringing fresh lemonade. "They're so happy, aren't they?" the housekeeper commented, who had practically become part of the family. Edward nodded, observing his daughter's carefree laughter as they ran across the lawn. "I can hardly believe the transformation," he replied, "when I think of the state I found them in that night." "You are transformed too," Vanessa observed, with the direct honesty that had always been her characteristic. "I've never seen you so present, so at peace." Edward reflected on the observation. It was true. The man obsessed with professional achievements, always rushing to the next meeting, the next contract, the next international trip, had given way to someone who had found a healthier, more human balance. "I almost thank Felicity," he said, surprising himself with the thought. "If it weren't for that terrible night, perhaps I would never have realized what I was losing." At that moment, Marina called him to join the game. Edward didn't hesitate. Putting his glass of lemonade aside, he ran to the garden, his shoes sinking into the soft grass. The late afternoon sun golden above their heads. Laughter echoed across the field, marking not the end of a story, but the true beginning. As he chased his daughters in the improvised game, Edward thought about how life could change in an instant. A moment of clarity, a painful revelation, a choice. The scene that had greeted him that night in London, his daughters rummaging through rubbish in search of food, could have been just the beginning of a tragedy. Instead, it had become the catalyst for a profound transformation, an awakening that reconnected him with what truly mattered. On the horizon, the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. A new day would come, with its own challenges and joys. But Edward knew, with a certainty that came from the depths of his soul, that as long as he kept his priorities clear, as long as he never again allowed work or anything else to come between him and his daughters, everything would be all right. Marina and Beatrice ran to him, hugging him tightly, their small hearts beating against his. And in that embrace, in that perfect moment of connection, Edward found the answer to a question he didn't even know he was asking. True success is not measured in professional achievements or public recognition, but in the ability to love and be loved, to be present when it matters, to build not empires but relationships that stand the test of time. And so, amidst laughter and hugs, under the slowly darkening sky, a reborn family continued its journey, stronger because of the storms it had faced, wiser because of the lessons painfully learned, more grateful for every shared moment.